Hi, my name's Phil. I enjoy talking about politics, and the winner for the poll for today's video was how might British politics actually change as a result of Brexit and after Brexit. So just warning you now, this might go in a few crazy directions. It is, of course, speculation based on the sort of things that have been said and happening, but it is speculation. British politics is hugely unpredictable right now. We're undergoing changes no matter what happens in the next few weeks, whether those changes become permanent or eventually swing back into some sort of usual equilibrium, I can't say. But politics is definitely going to get crazier before normality, whatever form that takes, is restored. Brexit is potentially the biggest upheaval in Britain since Cromwell decided to go bowling with Charles I's head. But the political makeup of our parliament is unlike anything I've experienced in my lifetime. In fact, the current parliament is probably the least capable of dealing with Brexit that we've had for, well, a generation at least. The government is led by a leader who is pursuing no apparent Brexit strategy, paralysed by fear of fracturing her own Conservative Party. With both sides of the political divide within the Tory party as belligerent as each other, the situation could potentially be quite different. Whether better or worse, I can't say. But there is one minority faction threatening to split the party, and so the leadership is dancing to their tune to avoid that. It's also a minority government, which, unlike Parliament for most of my lifetime, well, this is not normal. We're not used to it. MPs are not used to it. In addition, we've also got an opposition party in Labour that has a leader completely out of step with at least 4/5 of his parliamentary party over the future of the UK in Europe, amongst other things. How different would things be now if the following previously normal situations had been in place? 1. Let's say we had a majority Conservative government with a leader strong enough to pass their legislation. In this case, the withdrawal agreement would already be in place, and we may well have already left the EU and be working on the negotiations for our future relationship. The Prime Minister wouldn't have had to put up with dissension from the far right of her party, and the situation, though worse than being in the EU, would at least be known and businesses could plan for their futures. 2. Or we could have had the current parliamentary makeup. We may have had a Labour leader in step with the people of the parliamentary party nonetheless, and of course wider support. The irony is that Jeremy Corbyn was never really going to become Labour leader. He was nominated for the leadership by MPs who wanted a real debate on the future of the party after Ed Miliband stepped down. They didn't expect or want him to actually become their leader, so the plan backfired a bit there. If they'd actually nominated MPs that they wished to support, as is quite usual in these matters, well, we could have avoided the anti-Semitism rows, we could have actually landed fatal blows on the Conservative government, and could now be pushing for a people's vote on our relationship with the EU. And that's assuming that the referendum was carried on as it was. There's actually an excellent chance that the referendum vote would have swung the other way altogether. Now, it may well be that the MPs who did that weren't really impressed with any of the candidates at the time, and I'd understand that. If only Labour had a credible leader through all this, we could have avoided all the pain. But are these freak political situations actually an aberration at a time when we can ill afford them, or is it just the start of a fundamental shift in the way politics is done in Britain? As a consequence of both these situations, the end result is that the Conservative Party is leaning further to its right and Labour is leaning further to its left. But governments are formed by parties who can convince Middle England to support them. That's where the bulk of people in the UK live. In other words, you gain power by capturing the centre ground. But the centre-left and right MPs, who represent the majority of their parliamentary parties in both the Conservatives and Labour, have been completely disenfranchised by their parties. In the case of the Conservative Party, because their leader has been held hostage, and by the Labour Party because Jeremy Corbyn is quite frankly the most dictatorial leader the party has seen since I've become aware of politics. Except, of course, when his allies disobey him. Oh, then he exhibits the sort of cronyism that even the sleaziest Tory would beam in pride of. And it's not like this is just a patch for each party to go through. No matter what the outcome of Brexit, the country and the parties are not going to heal their divisions. Those divisions are actually going to become much worse because Brexit is so binary. We are either a member of the EU with all the influence and wealth that that position attracts, or we are not. At the moment, it's not completely clear what the result will be, even though some outcomes are more likely than others at this point. There will come a time when the choice is made and we are committed to one conclusion. At this point, those fractures in both society and the major parties could just explode. There's already been serious talk of a split in Labour. Not a massive number of MPs are implicated. In fact, when I read the reports, it seemed to be half a dozen MPs. Half a dozen's not a split. That's just 6 MPs deciding they don't want to be members of the Labour Party. But that's just according to reports. No one's actually come out and said that as far as I know. But someone in Labour was nonetheless very worried. At the end of last week, there was a threat to deselect a very well-respected Labour MP for the next election. The motion was dropped fairly quickly, but it has resulted in fault lines in Labour being foolishly exposed just at the time when they should be picking at the wounds in the Tory split. As is symptomatic of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, whenever the Conservatives are down, Labour managed to trip over themselves instead of going in for a killing blow, and somehow managed to end up worse off. It may well be that the majority of Labour MPs do give Jeremy Corbyn one more general election to make good. Quite frankly, losing 2 elections in a row is more than any political leader has survived, to my knowledge, in modern times. But it would certainly present 2 choices for Labour should he lose that election. One, either he steps down or is defeated in a leadership election, but for that the Labour grassroots would have to abandon him. Or 2, Labour will split at that point, with the remains of the party becoming more left-wing. Then there's the issue whether any majority government at all will form in the next general election, or even anytime soon. People are suggesting that the party that takes us through Brexit can't possibly win. But Labour are implicated just as much as the Conservatives, really. Although Labour had no say in the negotiations, they did have a say in Parliament, and not only went along with all of the legislation that's been passed on Brexit, up until the withdrawal agreement that is, but failed to steer us away from the hard Brexit. So let's look at a couple of scenarios when it comes to the next general election. 1. Let's say, just for a laugh, that the unicorn hunters succeed and Brexit is marvellous. Well, obviously the Conservatives would win the next general election because they'd be credited for it. Or 2, let's say Brexit is a disaster. The Conservatives would be blamed, sure, but then so too would Labour. The result is likely to be another minority government either way. It needs to be borne in mind that whatever outcome we end up committing to, people will say that other options would have been better. If we crash out because Labour don't support May's deal, people will say that it would have been better with that deal. But if we support the deal, then people will say it would have been better off with no deal. It's impossible to win. Labour are literally in a lose-lose situation here. They haven't done anything to help the eventual Brexit conclusion, so they get no credit for any fantasy benefits that people may think emerges, but they've also done nothing to hinder it either, so they'll also be implicated in its failures. If Labour win and form a minority government, then it will achieve almost nothing, as it won't get the support for the bulk of what Corbyn wants to achieve. Labour will have had its once-in-a-generation chance at power, blown it, and not be given another chance. Because if there was one thing Corbyn has shown, is that he's not into either compromise or pragmatism. Faced with being unable to pass the legislation he really wants, he'll never look at what he can usefully pass. If the Conservatives win yet another minority government, their own MPs will blame the leadership, whoever that happens to be at the time, of tainting their image by pandering to the far right, or a former Conservative chairman once called them the swivel-eyed loons. That could see them split as well. Now, if both things happen at the same time, it may well see them come together to form their own centrist party. But why not just join the Liberal Democrats? Some people have said that. Join the Lib Dems. But the answer is one possible reason why the split may not happen at all, even though a majority of MPs clearly feel like foreigners in their own party at the moment. In terms of voting habits, there are some people who will vote for a party whose principles most match their own. But the vast majority of voters are choosing between parties that have a realistic chance of forming a government, which means Labour and the Conservatives. This is because most people are quite practical when it comes down to it, and we've been used to majority governments in the UK. In a society where coalitions are the norm, smaller parties can wield influence, and people see that. But in majority governments, the opposition MPs can do nothing. All they can do is join committees and talk about things. They have no influence at all, as the government has all the numbers it needs to push through its legislation. So why vote for a party that can't ever enact its policies, no matter how much you approve of them? Better to vote for the party that most matches your outlook of the two that could form that government. That way people feel they're actually voting for change. As such, a new party would have little chance of forming a government because nobody will see them as a prospect for government. Not impossible though, as was shown recently in France, but it is highly unlikely. On the other hand, if the UK enters a period of more minority government, it may well be that smaller parties can be seen to wield influence, In environments such as this, people may start to vote for the party of their choice rather than just restricting themselves to the best out of the big two. In this scenario, a split is much more likely, as the smaller party may not form a majority government, but it could wield major influence, and then it could build on that to become a much larger party. In that situation, the Remains would shift further to their extreme wings, as I already noted, and the centrist parties could become the dominant political force in the UK. However, they may still not be able to form a majority government, and we might actually end up with the sort of coalition parliaments that some other European countries are already used to. But there are an awful lot of ifs there. It depends on how Brexit concludes. For Labour, it depends on whether the party members will keep supporting Corbyn despite his refusal to back their people's vote. I suspect they'll be quite unforgiving of the leader of a party that's had its origins in defending the rights of ordinary workers. Well, if he steers us towards those people losing their jobs and stagnating wages for those who remain employed, yeah, I don't think they're really going to be impressed with him. It seems to me certain that Corbyn will never try and make friends with his own MPs, so the only future I see for Labour is in ousting Corbyn before it's too late, and who knows when that is. For the Conservatives, it'll depend on who follows. Also, I suppose what happens in the next general election. Conservatives have always been a divisive party throughout my lifetime, but they do sit down and shut up when you've got a strong leader with a good majority. They know that they only gain power because they're the only right-wing show in town, and because of the first-past-the-post elections. Of course, were Scotland and Northern Ireland to leave the Union, that would make things easier for the Conservatives. Northern Ireland's loss would reduce the total number of MPs in the House, and so you wouldn't need as many to get a majority. And Scotland only ever helps get Labour into government, never the Conservatives. Of course, the success of the SNP at the moment is actually helping the Conservatives, but losing Scotland altogether would help them out much more. So the irony is that the so-called Unionist Party of Britain benefits from the breakup of the Union. They also know that every time they're thrown into opposition, there is a chance that the electoral system could change. After all, the current system benefits them the most, and if we ever get a non-Tory government that ever thinks long-term, I would think that would be on their list of things to change. Now, the last time there was a referendum to change it, people voted to keep it the same. But would they do so again? I'm not so sure. Besides, there doesn't even need to be a referendum to change it. Were proportional representation introduced, the Conservatives would suffer. I'm not saying they'd be wiped out, but they would not do nearly as well in general elections as they do now, where the left-wing vote is split among several parties. They'd also likely to lead to more coalition governments. In this outlook, the Conservatives have no value in remaining as one split party divided across the entire right wing of politics. And they would almost certainly split up into smaller parties. But if there's one thing that Brexit, I think, has shown, it's that people are hungry for a change in the way that politics is done in the UK. I'd almost think that people will eagerly support any ideas for change at this point, no matter what the change is, no matter whether it's an improvement or just makes things worse. I just think people are up for voting for a change. Brexit and the election of Trump in the US too, come to it, showed that to us. Two countries categorised as nations run by governments who seem to have no accountability with their population were both given a punch in the face by citizens a couple of years ago. But neither government seems to still be listening to that message. So as I said, crazier times to come. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, and until next time, I'll see you later.